today to Frans Timmermans, the European Commission's Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal. Mr. Timmermans, welcome. Now, Vice President Timmermans, we all know that the climate crisis was not caused by African countries. The continent only contributes around 4% of global carbon emissions. What is Europe's responsibility when it comes to helping Africa to cope with this crisis?
Well, I think, first of all, our two continents are Siamese twins. If Africa does well, Europe will do well. If Europe does well, it can really provide some support for Africa as well. If Europe suffers, it will not be focusing on the importance of working together with Africa. If Africa suffers, the problems will come to Europe without any doubt. So the sooner everybody understands this, the sooner we can find solutions. Now, what I've seen over the last year is really a change of heart on both sides. I think finally, the Europeans are getting rid of their paternalistic attitude towards Africa, because I see everywhere we're looking at African plans. We're not bringing plans to Africa. Secondly, even though Africa isn't responsible at all for the situation we're in, Africa's already experiencing the consequences of that situation. So I think there's a huge also global responsibility, but also specific European responsibility to help Africa with mitigation and adaptation in this climate crisis that already has huge effects. Look at the droughts, look at the storms, look at the weather that has become completely unpredictable, look at the locusts infestations we've had in Eastern Africa. So yeah, that's where we need to be partners. And secondly, apart from adaptation and mitigation, it's about time that every young African, wherever they live, had access to the internet, had access to electricity, and that can only happen if we embrace the idea that we can decentralize electricity generation, bring it to villages everywhere. And for that, you need renewable energy. For that, you need solar power, you need wind, you will need hydrogen at some point. And also in all these things, we can work together, and specifically on South Africa and a number of other countries, you need to wean yourselves of coal, which is going to be a huge challenge as well.
Absolutely. I mean, how do you respond to the argument that, well, Europe was able to benefit from very cheap fossil fuels for decades to fuel its growth, and Africa should be allowed to do the same thing?
I think Africa has a huge opportunity with its young and vibrant population to leapfrog over a number of developments, and to at least avoid some of the worst mistakes we made in Europe over the last 150 years. So if you first create a bigger dependency on fossil fuels, to then have to wean yourselves from that is more difficult than to immediately try and embrace new forms of energy. And I'm more and more enthusiastic about what I see in Western Africa, in some countries, in Eastern Africa. I was in Ethiopia earlier this year, and also there, the understanding that you can have villages with their own power generation based on solar and wind is bringing it's also a form of emancipation, and it's also a form of bringing more social justice also to remoter areas and countries.
Mr. Timmermans, you have been leading efforts to introduce a Green Deal in Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about what this might mean for Africa?
I think it would mean that you bring new forms of energy generation, or upscale them. The potential for solar energy in Africa is huge. Don't have to explain that. The potential for carbon sink, through your natural environment, through forests and grasslands, etc., is also huge. Potential because we also have a biodiversity crisis. We're losing 1 million species if we're not very careful. The potential for Africa to contribute to our biodiversity resilience worldwide is huge. We need to stop deforestation of primal forests in Africa. That's of huge importance. But especially the potential for younger people to learn trades, to study, to be part of an economy that's going to be extremely vibrant is huge. Africa has such potential. And the Green Deal is a growth strategy. It's not just about tackling the climate crisis. It's also about bringing about new forms of economy, circular economy, no longer based on fossil fuels, no longer based on wasting commodities, but rather on recycling and on reusing, etc. And for Africa, this has a huge potential. You know, recycling and reusing is not something most Africans are unfamiliar with.
How, when you have these conversations with other African leaders, how receptive are they to these kinds of ideas?
Well, I think that the what's driving this, I think, frankly, is worries about climate change, which I see have increased exponentially in most, if not all, African countries. Secondly, they see economic opportunity, given the fact that we're also in an industrial revolution, and as I said before, Africa would have the possibility to leapfrog over a number of stages in our economic development if it is done right. Thirdly, I think what really is important to note is that more and more European countries are not talking to African countries by saying, we know what's good for you, but saying, we're listening to you. How can we help? How can we be part of this? Because we see opportunities for us as well. And then, of course, there's also the elements that I really welcome in an increasing number of African countries, the societal structures we have in Europe, the rule of law, freedom of the media, a vibrant NGO community, things that especially many young Africans aspire to as well. And if politicians have any sense, they would cater to those aspirations rather than suppress them.
There was a major vote in the European Parliament to cut carbon emissions by 60% by the year 2030. First of all, congratulations, that's a major accomplishment. But what we have seen already is that, when confronting carbon emissions, some companies choose to simply outsource those emissions to other parts of the world. How are you going to prevent European companies and countries from simply outsourcing their emissions to Africa?
Yeah, this is, I'm really glad you raised this, because this is a trap we should avoid. We've seen it before with waste, with plastics. We get rid of our problem by bringing that stuff elsewhere, and we should avoid this from happening here. This will depend a lot on the strategic partnerships we want to develop with African countries. It would also depend a lot on the behavior of private investors that we can influence. So how can Africa contribute to this? I think to look very much at governance, at investment protection, at working together with us to make sure that we can attract investment. And also we should address the issue of global corporate governance with a lot of force. If Europeans get all worked up over deforestation in Africa, in Latin America, they should all get worked up as well about who's responsible for this. And sometimes the responsibility lies with the European companies. So we also have an issue to tackle here of corporate responsibility. And I hope we can convince the majority in the European Parliament and in the Council to hold our companies accountable for this. And if they don't, if they're not accountable, that would have consequences for their cooperation and their support in this transition.
So just to clarify, will you be pushing for legislation that specifically regulates the way that companies behave in other parts of the world?
Well, first of all, I think this should be part and parcel of any trade agreements we sign with other parts of the world. Secondly, I think this should be part of the strategic agreements we reach with the African Union and with individual African nations. Thirdly, I think corporate governance internationally should also be part of the proposals we make for legislation in Europe. And I know my colleagues are working on this. We've been working on this in the past, but we need to improve that. So I think on all these levels, we can make sure that we don't have these negative consequences that are indeed a trap we should avoid.
I want to get onto the issue of migration. Of course, we know that there has been a wave of migration from African countries to Europe, driven at least in part by changing climate conditions. We've seen the conditions in camps like Moria in Greece. We've seen the boats left to drown in the Mediterranean. At the same time, you've had instances of Europe giving money to dictators like Omar al-Bashir to try and prevent migration from occurring. In this context, how can we trust Europe to do the right thing?
Well, I think the only way we can actually come to solutions that are effective, but also morally acceptable, is when we address the root causes of all of this. Once young people have paid smugglers in their home countries and are on their way and risk their lives in the Sahara or elsewhere, and then risk their lives again on sea. It's in fact already too late. The only way we're going to solve this is if young people have enough confidence in their own futures in their own countries, that they don't feel the need to migrate. Or when they feel the need to migrate to work in Europe, that we have a legal system whereby they can apply for visas in a way that is realistic, in a way that gives them an opportunity to come to Europe. And I think only if we do that can we find solutions.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but we've got countries like Italy and Greece, which have taken a very hardline approach to both refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants, arriving on their shores. How are you going to get them to toe the line?
Well, first of all, we need to be fair to those countries. For many, many, many years, they've had a very liberal, very open attitude to refugees. And then, of course, because of the war in Syria and because of other reasons, they were at some point overwhelmed. They asked their European friends to help them and got very little, almost no response. And at some point, they started to wave through these migrants and refugees. And then other countries in Europe accused them of not following the rules, which they didn't, but they had asked for help for such a long time. So the problem here is, in essence, a problem of moral hazard within the European Union. European nations who don't trust each other. Some nations who think they are doing too much. Other nations are saying, yeah, I'm not at the border, but all these refugees end up in my country, although I'm not at the border. And also a third group of nations who say, we can't be bothered, you're on your own, we're not helping. And all of this has contributed to a very poisonous cocktail of moral hazard in Europe. And the ones who pay the highest price in this context are the refugees and the migrants. So that's why we're trying to change that paradigm, to come up with ideas, realistic ideas about shared solidarity, about sharing the burden, but also realistic solutions to provide clarity in the shortest possible time to people who present themselves at European borders demanding asylum, whether they have the right to that asylum or not.
What are some of those solutions?
As I said, if we don't talk about tackling the issue at the source, we'll not succeed. So we need to do everything we can to provide more opportunity in African countries themselves. Sometimes countries grow very quickly, but then the economic growth falls into the hands of a very, very small elite, and even very well-educated young people feel cut out of their own society. So they look for opportunity elsewhere. And this has to change. I mean, I think there's probably very few African leaders who don't understand that they need to change this. So where we can contribute through an Erasmus program, which offers higher education, through training on the spot, through other means, through investment, as I said before, to create a better opportunity, I think this is what we should be doing. But once people do come to Europe, we need to have procedures in place, and that's what the Commission has proposed a couple of weeks ago, that would offer, especially from those countries people come from where we know they will never have the right to asylum because they don't flee from war or natural disasters, that they get clarity very quickly, because now they can just play the system very often, sometimes even for years, coming from countries where we absolutely know they have nothing to fear, and still they can, if it gives them 2 years in Europe, that they can work illegally, etc. For 2 years, those are, for young people, these are at least 2 years they're not starving, or they're not in dire straits. And even if at the end they're then sent back, sometimes, I think only 1/3 of the people are actually sent back who don't have the right to asylum. So that's part of the system. That's the thing. It sounds very harsh, but I know Europe really well. I think I can say that if we don't make the distinction very clear between those who deserve to be protected and those who don't, then we will not protect anyone, because then our population will say, well, if you can't make that distinction, we will not accept anyone. And then people who actually flee from persecution or war will be refused asylum in Europe. And that would be, then we take leave of our most fundamental values. But we're not a long way from there if we don't fix the system.
Mr. Timmermans, thank you very much for a very interesting and engaging interview.
It was my pleasure. Well, I really hope South Africa will be doing extremely well, and I miss it, and I hope to be back soon as we can travel. And all the best to you and to your loved ones, and stay safe.
And to you, and I hope to see you here in this country sometime soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Have a lovely day. Cheers. Bye.
You too.
Welcome, bienvenue to the 4th S&D Africa Week. My name is Céline Fabrequette, and today I am live from Brussels and will be your moderator. I wanted to say hello to those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live, so hi, and also on YouTube. Today in the studio, I'm with Andreas Schneider, member of the European Parliament and coordinator of the Global Progressive Forum, and Rebecca Tyson, Policy Officer for Climate Justice and Sustainable Development at Centre National de Coopération au Développement de la Belgique. Thank you both for joining me physically. It makes me feel less lonely. Joining us through the web stream, Mitika Mwenda, Executive Director at Pan-African Climate Justice, and also member of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Hello to you, Mitika. Miriam Daly, member of the European Parliament and S&D Vice President for a Green New Deal. Hello, Miriam. Nesrim El Saim, UN Secretary General, Youth Advisory Panel on Climate Change, is also with us, as well as Dr. Stefan Adawin, researcher and international consultant, Assistant Professor of Population and Development at the Department of Demography at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Welcome, 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 everyone. Together with you, we want to look at how to climate-proof the European-African partnership. What responsibility does we each have as individuals, communities, companies, politicians, and nations? Which sacrifices or changes must be made? What is a fair, more sustainable socioeconomic approach to better protect people and the planet? We will try to provide a little bit of an answer for everyone. But let us start with a couple of key instructions. This panel is also live interpreted in French. If you have questions or comments, feel free to write it in français ou en anglais towards any of our panelists or myself. Please write it down on the Facebook Live, the YouTube Live comment underneath the live, and I will do my best to ask it directly to the panelists. You can also use the hashtag #WithAfrica on Twitter to let us know what you think and ask your questions. All panelists are on Twitter, so feel free to tag them. This is a safe place, which means that everyone is allowed to express themselves without feeling bullied or threatened. And so any comments which are discriminatory, racist, xenophobic, and insulting towards any minority, POC, and LGBTQI+ communities will not be tolerated. The chat will be strictly monitored. So now we are all on the same page. Let us get situated and started. So I would like to give the space now to Andreas Schilder, who is a member of the European Parliament and coordinator of the Global Progressive Forum, to tell us a little bit more.
Thank you, and good afternoon also from my side, and welcome to the session, Building a Climate-Proof EU-Africa Partnership. It is one of an interesting session during the S&D Africa Week, which is organized by S&D, which is the socialist group in the European Parliament, FEPS, the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, the Max van der Stoel Institute, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and the Global Progressive Forum, which is also an institution which tries to work together globally, not only politicians, but also academic and NGO world. Emissions and also the climate change does not stop at the borders. So Europe and Africa are deeply connected because what happens on the one side of the Mediterranean Sea also has consequences to the other side of the Mediterranean Sea and vice versa. So on the one side, the European Green Deal, like also Frans Timmermans was saying just recently before, is an unbelievable big and strong project. We want zero net emissions until 2050, and until 2030, we want a minus of 60% of CO emission. And also African countries adopted the plan to have climate neutrality until 2063. So we see there is a big impact and big consequences of the ongoing climate change in Europe, like melting the glaciers, having hot summers and all this effect, but also in Africa, where the global heating is even more dynamic than anywhere else in the world. So 70% of the African people make their living on agriculture. So this means if there is a climate change, they have a huge impact. Weather change, biodiversity also has direct and huge effects to everybody on the African continent. The Africans are the worst hit, and on the other side are contributing least to the global emissions. So if we want to tackle this, it's not only about climate action, it's also about social and economic justice. The Green Deal is a good opportunity to reshape the EU-Africa relations, so to make out of the European Green Deal also a global Green Deal on a fair and a climate-proof and a social just future. And I think this panel today is perfectly one to go into deep in these questions.
Yes, indeed, Andreas. Thank you so much for situating us and giving us a bit of information to start our process. I'm going now to ask each of our panelists to let me know, how is climate change affecting your life, their life, and the people and environment around you? So, how would you like to start, Rebecca?
Bonjour à tous, merci pour l'invitation. Je vais parler en français ici, mais n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en anglais par la suite, je peux répondre dans les deux langues. Donc, le changement climatique, comment est-ce que ça affecte ma vie au quotidien? Je vais peut-être d'abord parler de mon engagement professionnel au CNCD 11-11-11. Donc, c'est une ONG qui se concentre sur les enjeux internationaux, dans mon cas, donc, sur la justice climatique, qui est, comme Andreas l'a dit, un enjeu de justice avant tout. Qui dit justice dit responsabilité. On en reviendra plus tard au cours de la discussion, mais donc c'est important pour nous de rappeler que la crise aujourd'hui est effectivement a été causée par certains pays plus émetteurs, plus riches, plus responsables donc de la situation actuelle, et pourtant qui ne payent pas le prix plein de la facture climatique, alors que d'autres, beaucoup moins responsables, sont aujourd'hui déjà les pieds dans l'eau, pour utiliser la métaphore. Et donc c'est important au quotidien de rappeler cette responsabilité, cette nécessité du coup de réparer et de faire justice. Mais peut-être dans ma vie plus quotidienne aussi, je pense que c'est effectivement un enjeu de justice sociale et de justice économique. Et donc c'est important aussi d'amener tout le monde à bord de ce combat. On n'aura pas une lutte contre le changement climatique en restant juste avec les élites et entre nous. Il faut absolument aller chercher plus loin à ce qu'on fasse aussi une convergence des luttes entre les différents combats, que ce soit pour la justice de genre, pour la justice raciale, pour une justice plus économique, pour un monde plus égalitaire. Et donc c'est ça, en fait, c'est pour un monde plus juste et plus durable qu'on se bat aussi contre les changements climatiques. Et donc c'est pour ça que je suis là aujourd'hui.
Merci beaucoup, Andrea. Désolée, Rebecca. Oh mon Dieu, ça commence. Les noms. I would like now to ask the same questions to Member of the European Parliament, Miriam Dalli.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So you asked a very pertinent question: how is climate change affecting us? And I will speak about my personal opinion, because I'm a member of the European Parliament from Malta, and I'm the S&D Vice President responsible for the European Green Deal. But coming from Malta, which is a very small island in the middle of the Mediterranean, makes me understand more the needs of ensuring that we have partnerships between the European Union and the African continent. And I'm saying this because only through that partnership. Andreas mentioned the Southern Mediterranean and the Northern Mediterranean. My country happens to be just exactly in the middle. And we understand the importance of bridging the two continents on many, many issues. I heard Vice President Frans Timmermans mentioning the issue of migration and refugees, but also when it comes to climate change. This is not a situation or a challenge that can be addressed by one continent alone. This is a global challenge where we really need to put our efforts together. It was mentioned earlier on how very few countries contribute greatly to the emissions. Let's not forget as well that we have around 100 companies that contribute to around 71% of the global emissions. So we need to make sure that those companies, those countries that are polluting most are the ones that carry the greatest responsibility. Responsibility is of all of us, but we need to make sure that those that are polluting more carry the greatest responsibility. What changes am I seeing? Coming from the Mediterranean Sea, I can tell you that this is one of the most regions that is vulnerable and susceptible to climate change. We are already seeing changes when it comes to sea level rises, when it comes to heat waves, and science is telling us that these things will only get worse. The African continent is hit harder than we are. We are seeing issues of drought. We are seeing people moving from one area to another because they can't continue living where they are. We are seeing situations of salination going into table water, the water that people should be drinking, and this is a reality. So if until a few years ago people were thinking that this is some myth that people are speaking about and it will happen in 50, 60, 70 years' time, not in our lifetime, now we're seeing it happening today. And that's what makes me understand that this is not just an environmental issue, this is a social issue, this is also an economic issue that we need to make sure that gets us all together to start addressing it.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you very much. I'll ask also Mitika Mwenda, the Executive Director at the Pan-African Climate Justice, to come in and also give his thought on what climate change and how it changes, his life and how is affecting his life and the people and environment around him.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. Thank you, moderator. The definition of climate change is broadly, basically the changes on a prolonged time within the environment and how it is changing. So it's not weather change. So it's climate change. You see, it's what we see in a prolonged time. How is it manifested? Right now, I come from the foot of Mount Kenya. That is eastern Kenya. And the observations which we are seeing, the changes in water levels, the changes in precipitation, the shifting rain patterns, shift of seasons. And so that's how we understand, because I come from a farming community. Right now, actually, we are in a planting season. Traditionally, what could be happening now, we should be experiencing massive rainfall. But because of the rain season has shifted, we don't know many people don't know when to plant. Right now, we should have planted, but now we are wondering whether the rainfall is going to come in the next week or in the next 2 weeks. And that is the kind of life we are used to do now. Very unpredictable rain patterns. And this is the reality of communities who in Africa who rely on rain-fed agriculture. 80% of our economies are driven by this. So you can see the ripple effect of this is that we are not going to be able to feed our families. Those who rely on agriculture have been plunged into uncertainties and many other things which are happening. And so this being a challenge which has not been caused by Africans, because all the scientific reports, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all other scientific reports cite Africa as the most impacted continent, whereas we have contributed negligibly, as the colleague who was speaking earlier has said, to this challenge of climate change. And actually, this is the issue of now justice. How are we going to address this problem when those people who have caused the problem from industrialized countries are shifting the burden of action to the people who have not caused the problem? And that's why we are saying, as long as we are not going to be seeing the comparable action from both the North and the South, from Africa and elsewhere in the world, then we are not going to be addressing this climate change through climate justice perspectives. So what we are calling as an organization, as countries, as individuals, is how are we going to ensure those who have caused the problem are going to address the problem the way it is supposed to do.
Mitika.
Remember, yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Don't give us all the details yet, because we have so much more questions to go through and so much more to dig in. So thank you so much for letting us understand the unpredictability of the climate change, how has that been affecting agriculture, and and possibility for people to plant and know exactly when to do the crops and everything. I'm going to just to recenter a little bit. I would like to let my panelists know, don't worry, I will give you plenty of time to express yourself and to say all that you need to say. But please try to keep your response to as short as possible, so then we all can get through all the answer. We can get to the people so that they can also request questions. So now, Nesrine El Saim, the UN Secretary General on Youth Advisory Panel on Climate Change, could you please let us know how climate change is affecting your life?
Yes. Well, I hope you are hearing me well. In total, more than 23 countries, African countries, suffered from floods this year. One of the most affected countries is Sudan. In Sudan, more than 870,000 persons lost their homes due to the severe rainfall and the flood of both White Nile and Blue Nile. This left more than 5 million kids out of schools because floods actually destroyed most of the infrastructure. More than 150 persons were killed because of the floods. Now, more than 10 million are exposed to waterborne diseases. The UN OSHA office in Sudan took samples from 13 states out of 18 states, and 30% of the water samples were actually severely polluted. This means that the effects and the destruction of the flood is not stopping with homeless people, refugees and IDPs, kids out of school, destroyed infrastructure, but it's actually extending that to other health issues. We are yet not fully recovered from the COVID-19, and our health system is suffering from severe malaria cases in more than 10 states in Sudan. Cholera and diarrhea, watery diarrhea, and especially typhoid as waterborne diseases are very much expected to extend in upcoming days. A lot of farmers actually lost their crops, and the total losses is actually more than $200 million in cash crops. Well, if this is not losses by climate change, if this is not a climate emergency, if this is not a climate crisis, then I don't know what can we describe as. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nesrine. As I Thank you so much. That was really on point, direct, and we got so many information. I wasn't even aware. I think here in Europe, we've been overwhelmed with the COVID-19 situation, and understanding how this, the COVID-19 plus the climate change and all together has been just exacerbating the impact and in terms of like population, climate injustice and social inequality within the African continent, but also in the European continent. So then now I will ask Dr. Stephen Adewin to again respond to the same questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. In my case, as Mitika already mentioned, I also come from the rural northern savannah of Ghana, just close to the semi-arid area, close to the southern fringes of the Sahelian region. And obviously, the issues of climate change tend to affect the people in so many ways, and particularly with majority of the people, like in many other African countries, highly depend on rain-fed agriculture. And most often than not, as Mitika rightly mentioned, it is only their contribution to global warming is really very insignificant. And besides that, they bear the brunt of climate change. And in particular, Mitika also mentioned the issue about the erratic rainfall pattern and unpredictability of climate events and how it impacts on the agricultural activities. And particularly, drought has become much more intensive and recurrent. And this is something that has mainly caused issues related to food insecurity. It has health implications for the people. And just as the increasing or the high temperatures also tend to aggravate cases of CSM, that is cerebrospinal meningitis, and a whole lot and issues related to malaria and malnutrition. So these are some of the areas that tend to affect people, especially those who are living in semi-arid environments across the Sahelian region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let me go a bit more. So you all kind of talked about how climate change has been affecting people around you. Most of the response of all of you guys were about like people around you. So I would like now to ask, how much of a priority do you think people see the climate emergency in their everyday life? And I want you to start by yourself. Tell me, what is the climate change, like what's the priority? In Europe, we've seen, and all over the world, we'll see the action of the youth through the Fridays for Future actions. And I feel like this action has really pushed a lot of decision maker, I think the EU Green Deal would have never happened without this big action and this push from the youth. So I would like first, Nisreen, for you to respond to this question. How much of a priority do you think people see the climate emergency, especially the youth, in their everyday life, and yourself, and how do you go about it?
Well, it's enough to say that I work more than 13 hours daily in climate action, and I've been working in the climate field since 2013. I was in my second year of university. So I think 2013, that means that now I have spent 7 years working in climate advocacy and climate activist. So I always say that I'm not a workaholic, but I'm a climate holic. So everything related to climate change is very much in the top of my priorities. It's also very important to comment on the commitment of the African youth regarding the climate change, because
all right, it seems like we're having digital connection issues with Nisreen, so we'll get back to you so then you can finish your answer, because I really want to hear about the action of African youth in regards to climate change. Are you here now?
yeah, I'm here. Do you hear me well?
Yes, go ahead now.
Okay. Yeah, so African youth are actually very much committed to climate change. We had the African Youth Initiative for Climate Change since, I think, 10 years now. Fridays for Future is actually a relatively new movement comparing to the movements in Africa, because the young people of Africa were actually witnessing the climate effects and the impacts of climate change for a long time. Actually, the movement of Friday for Future is a tool, but it's somehow global north or developed countries tool, because a lot of kids and children in Africa actually doesn't go to schools, and in Sudan alone, more than 5 million kids at the age of school are not going to school. So it's a really privilege to be able to get educated, and striking from education is not really the ideal thing to do in our situation. I always, when I do some activism with young people, I always mention that there's other tools to actually deliver your voice, and there's other tools to use to react with the global climate movement. And as I earlier mentioned, younger people of Africa are, like, for a long time actually committed a lot for climate change. Still, it's a very big issue to spread the awareness about climate change, especially in the urban communities, which is a surprise for a lot of people, but rural communities are witnessing the changes very much, and it's very easy to connect the climate change basic concepts to their daily life, not like the people in the urban areas or cities. We are trying a lot, but we have many other issues also linked to climate change, but not directly. If we talked about poverty, if we talked about lack of access to health systems, etc., and it makes it very hard for young Africans to focus on climate advocacy. But it's very long, and it's there for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nisreen, for providing us this very insight and this understanding that may as one tools can be working in a certain part of the world, that same tools may not be working in another part of the world. So we need to develop more different tools and more support and opportunity for everyone to be, as we always say it from the beginning, part of the change. And Miriam, would you please also be able to tell us, as we're gonna go with you to the second question, because I feel like this may be something that you will be able to advise us on. Last week, the European Parliament voted the first ever EU climate law, in which they voted 60% cut of emission by 2030. In your first response, you kind of started to a little bit talked about the emission. In your view, what are the two most important measures to achieve climate justice at the European level, but also at the international level?
Good. I'll give you three actions, which I think are extremely important. But let me start with the climate law. And I will start with the climate law that we voted in Parliament only last week, because it is a great achievement for us as European Parliament, but allow me to say for us as Social Democrats as well, because we were at the forefront fighting for an ambitious climate law and to have a vote with the majority of the European Parliament to reduce emissions by 60% by 2030 was no easy feat. We had to fight a lot for that, and we fought for that because we believed in achieving something that makes sense at this point in time. Today, when we speak about climate, we are speaking, Nizran said, about a climate crisis, and she's right. Because if we do not address climate, then we have issues with our competitiveness, we have issues with our social fabric, we have issues in our localities, we have issues with the social aspect. It is not only about the future of our children, because many people say, you know, we're doing this for our children. We're doing this for ourselves because it is happening today. So we are being ambitious today because we know that it is realistic. It has to be done, because if it's not done, we will suffer the consequences in the years to come. And also because we have other continents that are taking the lead. And if we want to remain competitive, then we need to act upon this. But you are right. We have to do this in the framework of climate justice. And you mentioned some measures. So first and foremost, for me, a very important measure is to ensure the effective participation of those people and communities that are affected. And when I say effective participation, it means that I want to see the active participation of the people that are affected in the planning, in the discussion, in the decision making, and also in the monitoring of climate actions. I think that would keep everyone on their toes, and it would ensure accountability. A second measure linked to accountability. We need to start hold accountable those responsible for the climate crisis. So we say that everyone needs to do their own part, but let's be very frank and honest. We need to start by holding responsible the companies and those member states who are at the forefront of responsibility when it comes to climate crisis. And the last point, we need to acknowledge the true cost of the climate crisis. And when I say acknowledge the true costs, I'm speaking about the social aspect, I'm speaking about the economic aspect, I'm speaking about the environmental aspect, and let's not forget the human aspect as well. That is really and extremely important.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Miriam, for this. Actually, I want to just come back with you because I feel like when you talk about accountability, the European Union already have the European trade, what's it called? The European trade system in terms of emission put in place. Would that mean, do you want this to change? Because I've heard that some big company are using this as a new way to make money.
The emission trading scheme as it is today, it's focusing on particular when it comes to big industry and when it comes to the energy sector. We have a situation where you have member states, for example, that do not reach the target and they are buying credits from other member states. But one of the most contentious issues that we are speaking about a lot of time, and not ourselves alone, scientists are speaking about this, and those who are at the forefront of addressing climate change issues, is the price of carbon. If we continue having a very low price for carbon, then the ETS as a system is not serving its purpose. Everything is showing that as we go along, the price of carbon will rise. If the price of carbon rises, then we will start seeing industry and we will start seeing member states acting. And I hope that that balance will be reached, because as things stand today, you are right when you say that there is this question marks, because with a very low price for carbon, we can never reach the measures and the targets that we want to achieve.
Thank you, Miriam. I would like to bring in Dr. Stephen Adewin. Maybe you could talk to us a bit more about because Miriam talked about effective participation. What other important measure do you see that is important to achieve in climate justice? And what do you think the role of the diaspora is in that regard?
Yeah, thank you very much. And as Miriam rightly pointed out about the issue about participation, looking at the dimensions of climate change impact, it is also widely acknowledged that the extent and the nature of climate change impact in the future remains uncertain. But what is obvious is that in the face of ongoing changes, we will have, what should I say, extreme events will become much more frequent and then much more intensive. But in climate change, in trying to address issues related to climate change in terms of mitigation and adaptation, there's the need for national governments and, should I say, foreign, should I say, in form of cooperation, collaboration between African governments and that of the EU and international partners. And to be able to effectively address issues related to climate change impact, facilitate adaptation and mitigation strategies, there is the need to mainstream climate change issues in development planning into national budget planning, and of course, to be able to come out with any informed climate change policy or any informed adaptation strategy, there is a need for research and data. If you don't have the data, if you don't have the information, if you don't have the right means to be able to determine or to at least to predict the extent to which climate change can affect the people, then you might not be able to come out with a, should I say, appropriate policy or effective policy to be able to effectively address issues related to climate change. And so for me, an important issue or aspect that we need to look at has to do with climate change data, climate change research, trying to look at the impacts on the average people and in how far their participation can also enhance strategies at addressing climate change impact. And by saying that, of course, in coming out with research or capacity building or data collection to inform climate change policy, it is also important to look at issues of funding. If you don't have enough funding, of course, the Africa Adaptation Gap Report, for example, estimates that Africa will face a significant adaptation cost of between 7 to 15 billion US dollars. So it tells you the cost involved in coming out appropriate measures or strategies to be able to address. So the issue of funding is also very critical to effectively addressing challenges and issues of climate change. And that is why I see the Green Climate Fund as a very viable fund that could actually enhance the ability of African governments to be able to effectively tackle the issues of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn to my right, towards Rebecca, and I would like you to bring in the Belgium perspective. You know, you've heard, I've been seeing you writing down a couple of, are you writing ideas to bring back to the Centre National de Coopération au Développement, maybe? But maybe you can tell us what are two important measures that the Centre National de Coopération au Développement have been putting in place?
Donc, comme je le disais, on est une ONG qui travaille beaucoup sur les enjeux internationaux. Donc, ce qu'on plaide pour être implémenté au niveau belge vaut aussi, bien sûr, pour le niveau international. Donc, la première chose principale, c'est, en fait, comme je parlais tout à l'heure, de responsabilité, d'assurer que les pays riches, les plus développés, prennent cette responsabilité en commençant à balayer devant leurs portes et donc en réduisant effectivement leurs émissions. Donc, Madame Dalli a parlé tout à l'heure du vote du Parlement européen. Ça doit encore être validé, notamment par le Conseil. Il y a une proposition de la Commission. Mais donc, ce qu'il faut, c'est vraiment un objectif de réduction d'émissions qui soit réellement ambitieux et surtout cohérent. Parce que c'est très bien, en fait, d'avoir des politiques climatiques ambitieuses. Mais si, par ailleurs, on conclut des accords commerciaux avec des pays qui, eux, sont très émetteurs, comme par exemple le Brésil, pour ne parler que du Mercosur, ça ne sert pas à grand-chose. Donc, on veut de l'ambition et on veut de la cohérence. Donc, ça, c'est la première grande mesure. Et la deuxième, Steven vient de parler du Green Climate Fund. Donc ça, en fait, ça fait référence au mécanisme qui existe depuis maintenant 10 ans, le financement climat international, qui est régi par donc la Convention 4 des Nations Unies pour les changements climatiques. Donc c'est un engagement des pays développés vers les pays en développement de financer l'adaptation et l'atténuation. Et donc c'est un engagement qui vient en fait d'une responsabilité. C'est pas de la générosité, c'est pas de la charité. C'est un engagement en fait qui répond à une injustice et donc qui tente d'aider ces pays en développement à s'adapter et à se développer de manière bas carbone. Et effectivement, le Fonds vert pour le climat, le Green Climate Fund, est un très bon instrument. Il en existe d'autres et c'est important surtout que cet argent, d'une part, ne vienne pas d'autres budgets des États européens notamment, comme par exemple l'aide au développement. Donc ça doit être un budget fixe, spécifique, indépendant, additionnel, on appelle ça, pour le financement climat. Et d'autre part, il faut veiller à ce qu'il touche réellement les communautés les plus vulnérables, qui permettent aussi l'émancipation des femmes, qui sont en fait souvent les premières victimes, mais aussi les premières actrices de changement. On pourra y revenir. Donc voilà, je pense que c'est ces deux aspects de justice, la responsabilité d'un côté et la solidarité de l'autre, qui font qu'on peut avancer vraiment dans le débat climatique.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was that was so good. Like, I really liked it. I wrote, I mean, you speak well and fast, but I still wrote a couple of things, and especially in regards to the climate fund, the green fund, and, you know, a fixed budget, independent, and it's additional. It is not charity. It's about injustice. So I really like that very much. So I would like Mitika to come in, and also because what you said something very interesting is about like that this fund goes to the right people. So I would like to ask Mitika, who is the executive director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, you know, who is a coalition of civil society organizations, to kind of explain to us how's the work of civil society organization have been, you know, supported through this sort of different sort of funds that they may be available. How do they see this being sharing and implemented and giving to, let's say, farmers, for example, for adaptation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Practically speaking, as the civil society, as the observer organization of Green Climate Fund, as the African node of the Green Climate Fund Watch, a coalition of civil society which follows this funding stream, we have been quite concerned about the access modalities of the Green Climate Fund. Not only Green Climate Fund, actually, all the climate-related funds, and whether that really, the mere fact that we have the Green Climate Fund, does that money reach the people at the bottom of the pyramid? So that's a very important question. And the answer is no. The way it is structured, actually, right now, it is structured in such a way that the access is only through government and international organizations. We are being told that the Green Climate Fund, for instance, supports a lot of adaptation, and most of the money goes to Africa. But when you look at it very keenly, it just, the money comes, first of all, the access modalities has been complicated in such a way that you go through intermediaries, which are international banks and intergovernmental organizations. So, and small organizations is never going to access that money. And even if that money comes, it goes through national governments, very complicated systems. It doesn't reach the people. So what we are doing, and as the civil society, is to ensure that the GCF follows, and through these principles of climate justice, that justice is those people who are supposed to get this money gets it in a very simplified manner. When we were fighting for Green Climate Fund, we wanted a fund which is not World Bank. What does that mean? that it should have simplified a system where that smallholder farmer gets the money. That is zero now. We don't have that. So we have lost on it, and we need right now what we are fighting is to ensure that that is reverted so that it supports the people who are supposed to, the victims of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, you heard, Andrea, you heard, maybe you have some things to add. Do you think there's a way the European Parliament could try to double check this green climate fund to see why it's not getting to the right people, perhaps?
Listen to this debate. I think it is, first of all, we are strictly convinced that it is important that this climate fund goes to the right people. So if there is doubt and evidence on this, I think we have to be on the core also to push to make it more effective as S&D in the European Parliament. Especially as we discussed before, we have to acknowledge that climate change is a global issue. So therefore also we have to understand it's always important to do the best possible in Europe, but it's also necessary to do it on the global scale. So speaking about this is also what I think was said before, is the true cost must be put on the table, and the true global cost must be put also on the table, which is about what is the social impact on the distribution between the people in the societies and between the continents. And also to, let's say, we have to fight those projects which have double benefit, which benefit the climate and also the distribution, like investing in public transport systems, which has an impact on the climate and also is helping people to be more mobile. Energy efficiency, you pay less for your heating, for example, and you don't pollute less. And then there's the big food and trade question, which I think we share in the Africa relations, because food production, meat production is one of the highest emissions. Mm-hmm. And we also know that this kind of food production which we have nowadays is destroying the basis of life for a lot of people in other continents. So therefore, we have to include this, like Vice President Timmermans was saying, in our trade deals, the climate issue on this basis. So then we can maybe reach some points which were mentioned in the debate before.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, all right. I hear there's money, but it's not getting to the people. I hear that there's a lot of commitment, but they need more commitment. So, my question is Africa and Europe equipped to deal with climate adaptation? What are we missing? Why are we just committing? Why are we not doing? Is the Green Deal EU doing enough? Would that be enough? There's also something that it's been a little tickling into my ear, but I hear a lot, is to say that climate change has the most impact in Africa. I don't really know about this phrase. I don't really like it that much, to be frank, because I feel like it has as much, it's a different sort of impact. Yeah, it has a bit, I don't think it has more impact in Africa. I think it shows more vulnerability of the continent because it's underdeveloped, but I don't think the climate change stuff has more impact. The action, the climate change has a lot of impact in Europe also. So that was my side comment, because I feel a bit weird about this phrase. So Miriam, I know you may leave us soon, so I want absolutely you to be able to respond to this question. Is Africa and Europe equipped to deal with climate adaptation? And if not, what is the European Parliament is going to be doing? What's the S&D group going to do? And what's on the agenda? You know, as you are the S&D Vice President for the Green Deal? Like, what's your plan?
So climate change definitely impacts everyone. It impacts every country everywhere, but you have some regions that are more vulnerable than others. You have some areas due to extreme weather that would be more vulnerable than other areas. You have some countries who are very close to the sea that have challenges that other mainland European countries, for example, will not be facing. And these are the different realities that we see across the globe. We have low-lying countries that are more vulnerable to changes in climate change than other countries. And those are the main, the countries that will be impacted first by changes in climate change. Is Africa ready for adaptation? I think I have to be very honest with you. No one is 100% ready for adaptation, and that's why more needs to be done. I remember when we were discussing during the climate change conference in Paris, climate adaptation was one of the topics that was high on the agenda, because there are those countries that need to start adapting today, and for whom measures of climate adaptation are extremely important. So climate adaptation needs to be given priority, and it needs to be on the table to make sure that all countries, all states, wherever they actually can adapt to climate change. Not forgetting that we need to have measures to mitigate climate change. So for me, climate change mitigation and adaptation, they go hand in hand. You can't have only adaptation without mitigation, and vice versa. What is the European Parliament doing? And is the European Green Deal enough? The European Green Deal has been floated as an idea for the past months. So we need to make sure that we deliver on what the European Green Deal speaks about. It speaks about carbon neutrality in 2050, which for many governments probably is something nice that they can speak about today, because for them what happens in 30 years' time might not be something so urgent to address. But they are wrong in thinking that, because if we want to have carbon neutrality by 2050, we need to start addressing things today. That's why what the European Parliament achieved last week is something to promote, because we're speaking about CO2 reduction in 2030, 9 years from now. And to have that kind of reduction, we need to start preparing as of today. It depends on us if the European Green Deal is a success or not. It depends on citizens to elect those governments that are really serious and committed about making sure that the European Green Deal becomes a reality, because those policies will make a total difference. What we will be doing in the European Parliament? I, for one, have always pushed for partnerships with our African neighbor countries. For far too long, I think the European Union looked at Africa, as a recipient of aid, which shouldn't be the way we foster partnerships. I look at our African neighbors as countries where we can do partnerships, particularly when it comes, for example, to renewables, when it comes to ensuring that we tap in the resources that African countries have and EU countries have, and make sure that we bring those together. This idea of the EU on one side, African countries on the other side, and that we're divided and we can't work together, I think we really need to push to make sure that it is addressed and changed, because if we want to reach carbon neutrality, no continent alone can do it, and we really need to get our act together and work together.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you very much. You said so many right things, and I cannot, be happier to hear that, to hear your commitment towards the Green Deal, towards your commitment towards creating an equal partnership with Africa, and also, again, to see that you always put the people at the center of the conversation. So I'm hoping that the people are hearing you. There's a lot of election coming up in a couple of years, so look out, ask the right question to the people, Accountability, yes, that's the word that I really like that you've been using. So thank you so much, Miriam. I would like Nisrim to come in and talk to us about talk to us about the UN Secretary General Youth Advisory Panel on climate change, because I know it's new. So when did it started? What is your role, and how can youth be involved? And when I say youth, I also mention the diaspora youth, Africa, EU, and diaspora youth. How can we get involved?
Well, one of our main mandates as a youth advisory group to the UN Secretary General on climate change is to be honest. And I want to give a small, honest insights or comments on what I've heard earlier from the speakers. First of all, the European Green Deal is not ambitious enough for us as African youth, because we are already witnessing a huge effect and a huge impact of climate change. And we cannot really imagine the world until 2030 or 2050. The second thing is it's not only adaptation, it's also loss and damage. And we all know that during Paris, there was a gentleman agreement to never mention the compensation of the countries that were actually affected by climate change crisis. But really, it's not working, because a lot of countries are actually having climate crisis right now that actually destroyed the infrastructure and other issues. Last but not least, whether we like it or not, Africa is one of the most vulnerable and the most affected continent by climate change, not only because of the geographical situation, but also because of undermined infrastructure, because of the poverty, because of the weak health systems, because of long years of colonialism that actually led to smuggle all of our goods to other countries. And for us, climate justice is not only about developed countries that actually had a lot of emissions and underdeveloped countries that are yet not able to use their goods, but it's also about what happened in the past and how the countries had their industrial revolution and with what raw materials they did that. And it's also about the upcoming future generation and are we able actually to maintain the same living style for them or not. And to go back to the Youth Advisory Group, we are actually there to deliver our voices to the Secretary General about climate change and do the opposite, also take some of the remarks from the Secretary General to the young people around the world. But it's more important to mention that judgment and actually holding accountable to different UN agencies and different meetings and the outcomes of the meetings, are they good enough for us or not, is one of the main agendas for us as a youth advisory group. And our main mission is not only Europe, it's not only Africa, but it's also very important to remember that we don't have a planet B. So this is our only chance to save the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nisrim. Thank you so much for shaking things up a little bit for us and bringing us back to the reality, because we were a bit dreaming a little bit at some point. So thank you for saying that climate justice is not just about the continent, but it's also within the different continent and also about the people. Thank you for saying that it's also about the past, our past and our present and our future. And I hope that your work in the Secretary General as youth advisor will be taken very seriously by the various different UN agencies, as well as the members that are members of those UN nations organizations. So I would like to then ask Dr. Stephen to maybe tell us about a successful story of how a change in attitude and more awareness about the climate emergency has has helped and, and can help. As you're a professor and, I know you're a scientist, so it's maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more about what you are working on lately and
Okay. Yeah?
yes, you're here.
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much. Of course, there are quite a number of success stories that I can talk about. And having had a short stint with the UNCCD in Bonn, I'm quite familiar with issues related to, for example, SDG 17, looking at land degradation neutrality. And of course, a success story that I always comes to mind has to do with, for example, carbon sequestration through afforestation projects that have been implemented in, for example, in Niger, where, for example, the World Bank through its community action program has kind of like initiated afforestation projects through the planting of acacias, Senegal acacia, in rural areas of Niger, where previously abandoned land was used, for example, to plant trees over a period of 14 years. And they recently, I think as in early August or so, I think they received an amount of $450,000, even though initially the people were a bit hesitant as to why they should engage in any afforestation project in an abandoned land. So they got the community involved, they got opinion leaders involved, they got women involved, and they didn't really see how they could benefit as a people. But with the project implementation of the project, they were able to sequester about, they established, or should I say, they planted about 7,200 hectares of acacia trees over a 14-year period, and they were paid carbon credit of about 450,000 to the 6 community regions where this afforestation project was done. And apart from the carbon sequestration and the involvement of the people, it also provided an opportunity for them for land regeneration, degraded land, and it improved their food production. The Arabian gum that comes from the acacia also kind of like provided an additional source of income for especially women, because Arabian gum is used for as a stabilizer in food industry, and that kind of like brought in additional income. Another interesting project that I would like to bring to our attention, and I'm sure most of us here are quite aware, has to do with the Great Green Wall that is being implemented across from Senegal, that is the west coast, to Djibouti. It's about 8,000 kilometers trees that is being planted along the southern fringes of the Sahara Desert. And it has in a way kind of like started yielding results in terms of improvement in land regeneration, or stemming land degradation, providing jobs for people, increasing food security for communities along those areas. In terms of what I am much more focused now as part of my own academic work, has to do with the interlinkages between climate change impact and in how far it influences migration, it impacts people, and that in a way also contributes to the mobility of people, especially in the West African Sahelian region, and also looking at issues related to climate change impact, natural resources scarcity, and its interlinkages with conflicts within the region. So these are some of the interlinkages, or should I say, areas of focus that I'm looking at as a researcher at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear like your example. We can, in your example, we can see that people are not waiting for the state, for the legislations, for the politician. They are already doing it. So all they need is not is more support. So thank you, Stephen, for sharing that, that great message. So we've talked about the people. Miriam Daly mentioned polluters and emphasize on the company and their responsibilities. So as we know that there are 100 companies, big companies, mainly, champions, European champions or American champions or Chinese champions, responsible for 71% of the global emission. What can we do to ensure that they take responsibility for this? What can we really do? Because does nation have any power? I mean, we talked about the European trade emission system, which is a bit like flawless. So I would like very much each of you guys to think about, within your perspective, within your organization or representation, what can you do, or what are you already doing to make those companies responsible, to make them change their behavior? Because we're not about like killing companies, we're about like making them change the way they are operating, right? So, Rebecca, would you like to come in?
Oui. Donc, je pense qu'il y a peut-être deux questions dans ta question. D'abord, le cas des entreprises d'extraction fossile, quels sont un cas particulier et je pense une cible particulière, et puis peut-être plus globalement, comment faire bouger le secteur privé et le monde de l'entreprise. Quant aux entreprises fossiles, il faut savoir qu'effectivement, elles sont responsables et ces 71% d'émissions visées, en fait, on les compte depuis 1988. Pourquoi cette date-là précisément ? Parce qu'on estime qu'à partir de cette date-là, elles ne pouvaient plus ignorer, elles devaient savoir les désastres et leurs pratiques, les désastres que leurs pratiques avaient sur l'environnement et sur le climat. Et donc, il y a en plus des résultats qu'on voit aujourd'hui dans l'atmosphère, le fait qu'il y a une responsabilité morale aussi à prendre en compte. Et donc, pour nous, il y a deux grandes solutions, deux grands volets d'action. Premièrement, c'est d'abord d'établir un traité au niveau international de régulation. Bien sûr, on peut commencer par l'Europe parce qu'on sait que la politique internationale n'est pas toujours la plus efficace, mais ce serait quand même le levier le plus influent. Et donc de réguler ces entreprises, de les obliger à être plus transparentes, d'avoir des objectifs de réduction d'émissions clairs, chiffrés, mesurables et surtout avec des objectifs intermédiaires. Donc tout le monde en 2050 veut atteindre la neutralité carbone, c'est le nouvel objectif à la mode, c'est très bien. Mais je trouve que ça ne veut pas dire grand-chose. Déjà, neutralité, c'est un terme qu'on peut discuter, mais en plus, c'est dans longtemps, 2050, et comme on l'a dit et on l'a entendu, les gens souffrent déjà aujourd'hui. Donc, ce n'est pas une urgence à conjuguer au futur, c'est des actions qu'il faut poser dès maintenant. Donc là, ça, ce serait une arme législative contraignante. Et puis, il y a aussi le fait que beaucoup de nos États, la Belgique notamment, investissent encore énormément dans les secteurs fossiles, notamment en leur permettant d'avoir des subsides. Donc c'est de l'argent public qui va de manière complètement gratuite et sans condition à ces industries-là. Donc ça aussi, c'est un système qu'il faut revoir, notamment par exemple si on pense juste au kérosène, et en fait que les avions ne payent toujours pas de taxes sur le kérosène alors que le train commence à coûter de plus en plus cher. C'est un exemple simple de l'absurdité dans laquelle on vit à l'heure actuelle. Donc c'est aussi aux États, et c'est très compliqué parce qu'on se regarde toujours tous en chien de faïence et on se dit si moi je ne bouge pas, mon voisin va bouger et donc je vais perdre en termes de compétitivité. Mais c'est important que les États aussi prennent leurs responsabilités, s'allient, et donc ça peut être au niveau européen, ce serait l'idéal, mais sinon on a besoin d'États ambitieux. Et donc c'est ce qu'on répète à nos différents ministres climatiques belges, qu'il faut aussi qu'eux aient le courage de dire stop aux voitures de société, de mettre en place des taxes sur les avions, etc., sur les billets d'avion, pour dire qu'en fait le pétrole c'est un produit qui appartient au siècle passé et que maintenant on va vers du renouvelable, on va vers des énergies propres qui respectent les droits humains et surtout qu'on arrête de financer cette crise en fait.
Merci Rebecca. Tu peux nous donner un exemple d'énergie renouvelable, énergie propre
C'est effectivement encore tout un débat. J'aurais peut-être.
Ah bah, tu t'es lancé.
Oui,
Vas-y.
oui, donc tout à fait. Donc tout ce qu'on appelle l'énergie renouvelable, c'est de base par opposition aux fossiles, mais je pense qu'il y a une nuance à bien sûr ajouter dans ce débat, parce qu'il y a toute la question des ressources naturelles, où on va aller chercher comment on les produit, et donc on parle aussi beaucoup d'économie circulaire liée à ce débat-là, parce qu'on ne peut pas continuer en fait à consommer comme on consomme aujourd'hui sans tenir compte des limites planétaires, en se disant bah, si c'est renouvelable, ça ira. Donc pour prendre juste l'exemple des voitures électriques par exemple, ou des éoliennes qu'on pourrait construire un peu partout dans les pays européens, il faut aussi bien se rendre compte qu'on va puiser ces ressources, que ce soit le cobalt au Congo ou d'autres, dans des pays aussi, et que ça exige de la main-d'œuvre, ça emploie souvent des mineurs, ça respecte souvent pas les droits humains. Donc au-delà de énergie renouvelable ou pas renouvelable, il faut aussi revoir notre système énergétique globalement, penser à de l'économie circulaire et penser qu'en fait toute énergie qui n'est pas consommée est peut-être aussi une bonne énergie et une bonne solution. Donc c'est aussi repenser à notre empreinte et à la manière dont on voit notre croissance et notre consommation d'énergie plus globalement.
Merci. I saw, Andrea, you were hushing, saying yes, yes, yes. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, I was saying yes because I think the first is important. The non-used energy is the best one. The non-built power plant is even the best one. I agree with what to do with global companies. It is to internalize the costs. We have to discuss about what is the cost of fuels, for example, why we have tax benefits still for kerosene and cheap diesel, why we allow that human rights are not part of trade agreements. Therefore, we have so extremely cheap metals and other things which are not cheap, because there is the highest cost which can be in human lives. So we have to speak about tax policy, because it is the big companies which are the big polluters and the big non-taxpayers, which are killing also the small and medium-sized enterprises. And we have to speak about regulations. As said before, the ECTS is not enough, because it is also a market system which is not functioning at the end. It's too slow. And then we have the question, just finally to say, sometimes said we need a global solution. And this is an excuse to say, we wait for the global government to give us a global solution, and it will not come. So I think Europe, as a European politician, I have to say every continent, and this is for mine one, has to start, or to take one slogan from one of the big companies is saying, just do it.
Thank you. Nisrim, would you like to come in and, have your swing at it and tell us what we could do about those big company polluting?
Well, I think one of the most important things to talk about is, we talk about young people are agent of change, inclusion of young people, different perspective of the youth, etc., etc. But when it comes to real, ideal decision-taking or process shaping, we actually shut young people away. For example, how much access young people had on the agenda of the EU-AU summit, what access young people had to the European Parliament itself, speaking about different issues, speaking about their views about the Green Deal, speaking about the ways, the innovative things that they are thinking in order to maybe shrink the area of movement to the big polluter companies. To what extent governments are actually willing to push private sector, how much of the different government officials have actually shares in these big polluters countries. And we have very obvious examples of big politicians or government officials actually having some budget inside of the big polluters companies, and then they come out and speak about climate change. Well, if they put laws to stop the pollution or the emissions from the polluter countries, they know that their economy is going to fall. They are not actually ready to have such crisis because they are very much worried about their political situation. I think the key answer for that is actually giving the right space for young people, not only to be part of putting the agenda for meetings, but also shaping the processes, whether it's laws, legislations, or even their participation within the opening hearing session in the parliament. It's also very important for Europe and other developed countries to invest more on green fuels or different things, because I don't think at this point people are ready to go back. No one is ready to use camels and donkeys and horses instead of cars. No one is ready to travel hundreds of kilometers or thousands of miles by foot, for example. We have to fly, we have to use cars. So how can we actually fly and use cars in more green way that than we are doing right now? This is the actual key, I think, question that we should ask, not how to push the polluters. I'm sure that science and technology are able to create something to clear the air from the emissions, or to stop the emissions from the factories and from the big companies. The main question is how much are we able to sacrifice the status we are living in right now, and how much we are able to open the door for young people to be actually engaged, not only trended in different meetings, to be actually engaged in the process making, decision making, laws, legislations, policies, and also opening hearing in the parliament. Well, EU-AU summit is coming very soon, and I know it's postponed because of the corona, but it's also not going to take a long, and it will be a real test for the actual European democracy and the actual African democracy. Are we going to have access to agenda? Are we be able to reshape and revise the agenda? Maybe we have something we need to discuss between African youth and European youth, African decision makers and youth, African youth, European youth and African decision makers. Are we going to have this space within, not in a separate forum, because this is what they usually do. They have the big event and then they have a small event where they put all of the young people there. We don't want to be classified as a different category. We are part of the community. We are actually more than 70% of the community in Africa, at least. We want to be part of the actual discussion, meet the decision makers. Actually, we are most people who are voting in Africa. So every officials, we reach any point by voting, we actually vote to put him there. So it's our right to have access to these people. I think pushing the private sector is not going to happen if we can't actually push the public sector and the government itself.
Thank you, Nesrine. Thank you. Rebecca, you wanted to come in?
That was for, non, c'était pour une petite remarque sur ce que Nesrine vient de dire. Je suis tout à fait d'accord. Je voulais juste peut-être attirer l'attention lorsqu'on parle de technologie. Elle a raison, hein, on peut bien croire que la science va finir par nous trouver des solutions, que ce soit la capture du carbone, le nettoyage des océans, etc. Mais je pense juste que si c'est clair et net qu'on a besoin de la technologie qui fera partie des solutions, il faut faire attention parce que c'est vraiment une fuite en avant de beaucoup de politiciens, notamment des plus conservateurs ici en Belgique qui ne veulent pas voir le changement arriver, de dire qu'en fait on peut attendre et qu'on va pouvoir garder le système comme on le connaît aujourd'hui et donc que la technologie va pouvoir nous sauver, que ce soit par des panneaux solaires ultra efficaces, que ce soit par justement toute cette question de la capture du carbone qui est très problématique. Donc je crois juste que c'est important de faire toujours la balance quand on parle de solutions, de bien rappeler que les changements de comportement et le changement de système, surtout le système qu'on connaît aujourd'hui en termes économiques et inégalitaires, doit aussi être remis en question. Je suis sûre que Nesrine le pensait, mais je me disais juste que c'était peut-être intéressant de le souligner encore une fois, parce que ça ne peut pas être laissé à côté de la conversation quand on parle de lutte contre le changement climatique, notamment vis-à-vis de ces gros pollueurs. Je remets mon masque.
C'est bien, c'est bien, c'est bien. Nous, on suit les règles. Hein. So yes, Nesrine, the EU-AU summit is being postponed. So I heard March, but let's just believe it's going to be June. And then in terms of I agree with you that youth should be involved. So just to let you know, the people that are organizing the AU-EU Youth Summit is the External Action Service of the European Union. They are the one who will build up the agenda together with the Commission, the development. So I can always put you guys in touch with the people in charge doing it if you want, Nesrine. So you can see if they will be able to share the agenda with you. And I'm also happy to put you in charge with the youth organization on the EU, diaspora, and Africa side who have been working towards putting together the AU-EU Diaspora Youth Summit. And also the other thing that you should try to think about is the presidency. So the German presidency has been quite involved, and the Portuguese presidency should also be quite involved in putting together this summit. In Europe, the Commission has put together a climate pact. This is our new civic structural engagement dialogue for people to get in, to share ideas, to create, not to create new things, but to maybe sometimes also emphasize on things that have already been done. So I would like to know what do you, because I also heard a lot of voting, the citizens and the voting. So yes, voting is very important, but then it's not, we also need to make sure politicians are accountable not every 5 years, but every 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, that they find a way to get back to the citizen and tell them, well, this is what I've done, and this is what I'm doing, or even explain to them why they are not able to move from a certain position to another. In talking about position, we know that within every country, every continent has different level of strength when it comes to negotiations. In the European Parliament, the Social and Democrat group is a very strong and important group, so they get to pass a lot of the things that matters to them and to their MEPs. At the European level, when the European Union sit on the table and start negotiating, well, it gets to also pass, the idea of the European Green Deal, the global Green Deal, came from the European Union. No? Or maybe they took it away and then make it even more better, so now we only think it's them, so I guess they did really well. Propaganda, So my question would be, what is the strength and the position of Africa when it comes to negotiation, when it comes to setting up his own agenda? Would you like to come in, Rebecca? Thank you.
Donc moi, je peux peut-être parler plus de ce que je connais au niveau des négociations internationales climat. Donc en fait, souvent, les pays se regroupent en termes d'intérêts, soit économiques, soit peut-être de plutôt similarités géographiques. Donc l'Union africaine représente un groupe dans les négociations qui a en fait énormément de poids, d'une part par la population qu'il représente, qui est quand même très très important. Par contre, il ne faut pas se leurrer, les intérêts économiques font également souvent le poids des négociateurs, et donc les États-Unis à eux seuls ont souvent beaucoup de poids et déséquilibrent parfois les négociations à cause de leur pression économique. Et donc ce qui arrive souvent dans les enjeux un peu plus, je dirais, tendus ou compliqués, c'est que les pays en développement se regroupent ensemble sous l'enseigne de ce qu'on appelle le G77, et parfois la Chine et parfois pas, selon. Et donc cela permet en fait de parler d'une seule voix et d'unir les différents intérêts des pays en développement qui sont quand même les plus affectés par les changements climatiques, on l'a bien entendu aujourd'hui. Et donc l'Afrique a là-dedans un rôle vraiment prédominant, d'une part aussi par la diversité de réalités qu'elle connaît. L'Afrique du Nord n'a pas les mêmes attentes et les mêmes intérêts par rapport aux négociations climatiques que l'Afrique subsaharienne, par exemple. Et donc ils peuvent vraiment porter une voix très alternative et complémentaire. Ce qu'on a vu aussi de manière assez récente avec le Covid-19, c'est le fait que tout a dû être mis de manière digitale. Donc la digitalisation a entraîné pas mal de problèmes, notamment vis-à-vis des voies de ces pays-là, à cause d'une certaine fracture économique. Tout le monde n'a pas accès à Internet, tout le monde n'a pas accès à l'électricité de manière courante et régulière, et donc ça a posé beaucoup de questions pour les quelques sommets internationaux qui ont été maintenus, notamment le Haut Forum pour le développement durable, donc qui a lieu chaque année en juillet à New York, que j'ai également suivi. Et donc là, voilà, ça posait vraiment une question d'inclusion, parce qu'on en parle déjà dans les forums quand ils ont lieu de manière physique, mais là encore plus, comment on s'assure que malgré justement ces différences de réalité, malgré cette fracture numérique, on permet à ces populations qui représentent en fait énormément de voix et qui ont des intérêts très très importants dans ces différents sujets de pouvoir être entendus. Et je pense que c'est aussi notre rôle en tant que pays développé, plus riche en tant qu'Européens, d'assurer que non seulement nos voix sont entendues, mais surtout celles qui sont en fait au front line, qui font vraiment front aux différents impacts du changement climatique.
Thank you, Rebecca. Dr. Stephen, would you maybe perhaps bring in your expertise and your view when it comes to the position and the level in regards to the scientists, to the African scientists? What's their position? What's their strength when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, thank you, Celine. I feel that. Obviously, Africa, there's so much intellect and so much that abounds on the internet, on the continent. And I think as researchers, we should be given the lead role because we tend to have a feel of whatever is happening, irrespective of wherever we find ourselves, whether in the diaspora or in Africa. And it is in this regard that I see, for example, big climate change projects like the WASCAL project, which is the West African Science Service Center for Climate Change and Adapted Land Use, which is looking at issues of climate change and of course land use change in West Africa. And we have a similar one in SASCAL. And we have African scientists who are more than capable, managing the research and data collection and probing complex issues, modeling climate data to be able to come out with informed findings that can actually drive efforts at climate change mitigation and adaptation. So for me, giving African scientists, giving them equal platform, equal opportunities, and of course, funding to be able to carry out complex research, informed research within the African continent as well is very, very critical. So for me, I think that as Africans, we are also more than capable. We have the talent, we have the expertise to be able to. The only thing we need is partnership in terms of capacity building, the technology to be able to undertake and measure climate change events. So I think that in this way, we are able to also contribute.
Thank you so much. We're almost finished, but before that, let's go back to our first question. How to climate-proof the partnership. So in 30 seconds, each of you, I'm not kidding, 30 seconds, tell me how to climate-proof the partnership of EU-Africa. Andreas, would you like to start?
30 seconds is extremely hard. So I would say we need a new relation between EU-Africa, which is more sustainable, more on fairness, and also more on climate-proof. And this cannot be put apart. You cannot be climate-proof and not sustainable. You cannot be social without being climate-proof. So this all comes together. And probably I saved some seconds.
Wow, amazing. So you heard it, climate-proof, sustainable, social. Yes. Nasrim?
Yeah, I think innovative would be the right word for me to say because, for example, if we took the issue of climate migrant or climate migration, there is a study in Sudan that actually says more than 70% of young Sudanese are willing to migrate to Europe, even if they know that there is 80% chance that they will not make it. And from a psychological point of view, this is actually semi-suicidal, because if you know that you will not make it and you still want to do it, I think this is very weird. And unfortunately, EU-AU solution for that was the military solution, to spread more forces in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, or in the borders of countries, for example, like Sudan, or coastal Mediterranean coastal countries like Egypt, Libya, for example. But this is not a solution. EU and AU should actually look for more optimistic and different ways, innovative ways, to actually convince young people that staying in their countries and staying in Africa is actually worth it, and their life is worth to live, and they will have a future for that. I think this is one of my main points.
Thank you, Nesrine. I will have Dr. Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. I will like to emphasize the fact that we should look at much more mainstreaming climate change into development planning, and of course into budget planning, national development plans. In order to be able to effectively do so, we need informed research, empirical evidence. We need data to be able to inform the kind of plans or strategies that we need to undertake to be able to enhance climate change mitigation and adaptation. And of course, to be able to do so, we also need partnership in terms of what? Funding, in terms of capacity building, to be able to advance this agenda. So mainstreaming climate change in development planning, funding, and of course, the participation of the people who are affected, people participation, communities who are affected, and these interventions are going to be undertaken, should be involved in the planning and implementation of these climate change strategies or measures that we want to undertake.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Rebecca.
J'allais parler en anglais. Oui, donc je pense que la première priorité, effectivement, c'est la place de la société civile. On l'a entendu plusieurs fois, mais pas que les grosses ONG connues et les interlocuteurs classiques, mais aussi les grassroots groups, les jeunes, les femmes, d'avoir vraiment aussi ces frontline voices présentes, pardon pour les interprètes. Ensuite, je pense que c'est important de mettre l'accent sur l'adaptation et les pertes et préjudices, loss and damages, parce que souvent on a un accent très clair sur atténuer les effets de gaz à effet de serre, trouver des solutions à ce niveau-là, mais l'adaptation, c'est aussi une réalité qui est nécessaire et qui est une urgence actuelle. Et enfin, remettre les droits humains et la justice sociale au cœur des politiques climatiques, parce qu'on ne peut pas lutter contre les changements climatiques sans avoir égard à ces enjeux-là aussi. Et donc, veiller à ce que toute mesure prise en place, toute politique implémentée, respecte aussi les droits humains et les objectifs de développement durable.
Voilà. Merci beaucoup. Thank you all of you who watch and join us today to discover and look at how to climate-proof the EU-African partnership. Thanks to my panelists for such insightful conversation, to the Foundation Max van der Stoel, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, the S&D Group in the European Parliament, the Global Progressive Forum, Friedrich Edbert Stufend, Thank you, Charlotte Billingham, for the confidence that you had in me. And also, I wanted to let you know, yes, I look amazing. So this is from Awasek, Les Moussa d'Awa. It's in Brussels. Here we go. So thank you, and I will see you soon. Bye.